September 30th, 1965. What kind of thoughts and images come to mind? What kind of sensations happen in your body when you hear this date? I'm sure that for almost all of us in this room, this date has very little significance. But for the people of Indonesia, it sits lodged in their collective memory as a day which would bring devastation to their country for years to come. You see, I spent some time in Indonesia studying trauma. That's what I do. I study trauma theory, trauma and theology, trauma and psychology, neurobiology. And as a minister, people are often a bit skeptical. They ask, "You're studying trauma? Really? Shouldn't you be studying something like healing or goodness?" But I've quickly learned that the study of trauma offers us a way of understanding how we move in the world, how we communicate with one another, how we see each other. And when we think about the divisive world in which we live, talks of who's in and who's out, who belongs and who doesn't, every ism you can possibly think of, maybe a new way of seeing is exactly what we need. I study something called collective trauma that gets lodged in the heart of different communities, people groups, and even whole societies. I traveled to Indonesia because it was on September 30th that the country experienced a collective trauma. And through my research, what I discovered is this: the events of the past don't stay in the past. And when we act as if they do, people get erased. For the people of Indonesia, September 30th, 1965 marks the day when 7 high-ranking generals were murdered by members of its armed forces in a failed coup. Now, the president at the time used this as an opportunity to blame the PKI, Indonesia's Communist Party, as the masterminds behind the attack. It was through this propaganda that the country was directed into genocidal activity as members of the PKI and anyone thought to be associated with the PKI became victims of a mass purge. Public killings became commonplace. You see, with the overwhelming threat of death all around, something was activated in the Indonesian people. It was fear. It was mistrust, causing those who were once seen as insiders to now become outsiders. Neighbors were no longer neighbors, they were enemies. Death toll estimates from this time range anywhere from 600,000 to 1 million people. You see, over time, a popular narrative was formed, one which claimed if you want this country to prosper again, if you want to feel safe, you have to first recognize who your enemy is. A documentary titled September 30th was shown in classrooms each year, depicting the PKI and PKI sympathizers as monsters, murderers, a danger to society, lacking any sense of a moral compass. Ex-political prisoners from 1965 and even their families now have a stamp on their official ID cards marking them as so. They lack access to jobs and care. They've become the objects of exclusion. The marks of the past, the marks of trauma, the fear and mistrust from 1965 remains nearly 50 years later. Now, the study of trauma asks us to pay attention to our bodies. So I ask everyone here to place your feet firmly on the floor, sit in a comfortable position, breathe in, and breathe out. What do you feel? What are you thinking about? What kind of sensations are happening in your body? Can you feel the pounding of your heart, the steadiness of your breath? How present do you feel in this moment? You see, we talk about bodies when we talk about trauma because trauma is something that exists in the body. It's different from how we talk about loss or sadness. Early insights into the field of trauma studies came when psychologists interviewed war veterans and realized that as they were simply recalling scenes from their past, violent events, they weren't just recalling them, they were actually reliving them. As in the experience of something like extreme fear, for instance, the pounding of the heart, the tensing of the muscles was being mirrored in the present moment, even though no current threat existed. When we experience an overwhelmingly violent event, something happens to us on a neurobiological level, and trauma is what refers to the gravity of this impact. It marks actual changes to our brain structure. You see, there's a part of our brain responsible for what is called the fight or flight response. When we experience any event, this part of the brain assesses the danger, releases stress hormones in order to protect the body, stores the memory of the event, and then the cognitive, rational part of our brain processes this memory, makes meaning out of it, so that by the time it's over, we can simply move on. But when we experience a traumatic event, this memory gets lodged in this part of the brain, never making it to the cognitive, rational side. This phenomena explains how someone who's experienced a horrific car accident nearly 10 years ago can find himself in a panicked frenzy after simply catching a whiff of the same air freshener that was in his car that day. The body reacts as though the event is still happening. It's like a wound that never fully heals. Now, when trauma gets lodged in the memory of an entire community, certain sounds, words, images can re-trigger body responses that cause us to turn in on ourselves, to reactivate that fight or flight response, to push out certain people for fear of our own safety. You see, it's this body response that causes us to run home, to cling to those who are safe and familiar, those who look, think, and act like us. For the people of Indonesia, it was this response that kept getting re-triggered as the need to push out anything resembling PKI became an affective decision based out of these emotional centers of the brain, not simply a cognitive, rational one. September 11th, 2001. What kind of thoughts and images come to mind? What kind of sensations happen in your body when you hear this date? I'm sure that collectively we can all come up with some image, some feeling associated with this day. You see, this date holds a particular weight in America. And while we all may have had vastly different experiences of this day, collectively, America experienced a trauma. Something was activated on this day. Language of national fear, national security, shock filled the headlines. There was a need to protect ourselves. But while this event happened nearly 16 years ago, the study of trauma asks, what remains? What continues to trigger those bodily responses to turn in on ourselves, to shut others out for fear of our own safety? You see, elements of the past constantly intrude on the present. They are the wounds that have never fully healed. Walk into any airport and you'll feel it as the eyes of those in uniform linger just a bit longer on anyone wearing Muslim garb. Listen to rhetoric surrounding who's allowed in, and you'll hear it in the voices of refugees pleading for safe passage. Watch protests of people simply fighting to be recognized, and you'll see it in the eyes of Black mothers who have lost Black sons at the hands of police violence. How do we heal? Right now, activists and theologians in Indonesia are doing the healing work of reconciliation after all this time. One of them remarked, the genocide of 1965, it not only killed people, but it killed our capacity to trust. So now she does the work of traveling Indonesia, finding survivors from the crimes of 1965 and asking them for their stories. You see, these are survivors whose stories have been discredited, discounted, shut out, erased. And as she sits with them, she begins with one simple statement. Tell me your story. Tell me what happened as I sit here with you. We can't talk about trauma without thinking about healing. See, there's this myth out there that in order to heal from a trauma, you simply have to talk it out, to dialogue. But when we experience a trauma, that cognitive, rational part of the brain, the parts that process speech, get deactivated. Words literally fail. Talking it out, dialoguing is no longer sufficient. You see, as this woman sits with survivors each day, it's not necessarily about the words that they're saying or even about her response. It's about everything else. It's about that thin, vulnerable space that exists between them. One of the things religions teach us, apart from doctrine and dogma, is the value of examining what exactly happens in that space between ourselves and another, that closeness which requires no words, because something happens there, something which acknowledges we're all connected to one another, that what's happening in my body matters for what's happening in your body. You see, there's a spirit there, one of compassion, of love, of empathy that pierces through the darkness of trauma. Go ahead and turn to the person next to you. Look them in the eye. You see, it's the spirit in this space that allows us to say, I am here, I see you, and we're present in this moment together. You can return forward. I really like how one psychologist puts it when he says, from the moment of our birth, we're dependent on others to relieve our distress. Our world, our country, our communities are in distress. What would it look like to think about our inner life at this moment in history? To examine the sensations that happen in our body, in our collective bodies, sensations that cause us to shut people out, to fear difference, disregard the other. What would it look like to think contemplatively about the way we've disregarded the pain of our neighbor? You see, because the study of trauma teaches us something about hope. Hope that when wounds surface in our communities, we might have eyes to see them, eyes to see that pain, which can't always be spoken. Because the reality is we are here, present in this moment. And it's in this moment that we're present together. Thank you.